was with great honor and humility I accept this nomination for President of the United States of America.
It is official. Joe Biden is the Democratic Party's candidate for U.S. president, but how might U.S. foreign policy change if he's elected? Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. The third time is the charm after running for president in 1988 and again in 2008. Joe Biden finally clinches his party's nomination this time around. To talk more about that, let's go to the White House, where we're joined by CGTN correspondent Nathan King. And Nathan, in last night's speech, Biden kept emphasizing how different he is from President Trump.
Yeah, but without mentioning his name too much. Let's face it, he had a lot of surrogates during the week to go directly after U.S. President Trump, including the former boss of him, of course, President Barack Obama. That was quite a moment. Yeah, it was more of a contrasting thing. He started off his speech by saying, hope over fear, facts over fiction, fairness over privilege. And I know he's been accused of plagiarizing speeches before, but he said it's not just red states in America and blue states borrowing from his former boss again, but you get the message. He said he would essentially be a president, if elected, for all Americans, including those who didn't vote for him, drawing a contrast to the current occupant of the building behind me. Let's take a listen.
The president takes no responsibility, refuses to lead, blames others, cozies up to dictators, and fans the flames of hate and division. He'll wake up every day believing the job is all about him, never about you.
Yeah, as you can imagine, we saw responses very quickly from the U.S. president in tweets. All caps means he's not in a good mood. And then we heard this a little later on.
China will own our country if he gets elected. They will own our country, and we're not going to let that happen. And you've seen the intelligence reports. China very much wants Joe Biden to win.
So you see the deflection there, criticizing Joe Biden, but also saying China, China, China. In fact, what was interesting about Joe Biden is the fact that he didn't take the bait on the China question. When it comes to U.S. President Trump, of course, we're going to have the Republican convention next week. Expect the China word to come up a lot. That's just
we'll be hearing a lot about that. Nathan, Biden did mention Russia and China in his acceptance speech, but those remarks very, very brief. What do we know about his foreign policy views? Can we expect perhaps the same policies he helped advance when he was under Barack Obama?
Well, if you've read the Republican platform, which I have, and other documents, they are critical on tariffs. They also talk about an open society, so no more closing down consulates in a sort of Mike Pompeo style. And the tariff question is very interesting. They had a couple of farmers on. They had Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin, a big key trading state, as you know, very critical of the tariffs. So I would expect them to be lifted, or at least some sort of quick negotiation so both sides can be lifted. However, you know, it's a democratic platform. And they tend to focus a little bit more on human rights. We've seen actions in Xinjiang, for example, from the U.S., Hong Kong. Would they stay? Probably less robust when it comes to military affairs, when it comes to Taiwan, for example. But remember, you know, even though the Republican Party is saying that China wants Joe Biden, there was an article in the Global Times, for example, saying some experts would like it. I've spoken to many experts on the China side who said they love the chaos of Donald Trump and the weakening of relationship with allies. The real point here is that Beijing really won't mind whoever is elected because they don't interfere in elections. And remember the rapprochement between China and Washington. Who did that come with in the White House? The arch anti-communist Richard Nixon. So I think, you know, there's a lot of posturing here domestically ahead of the polls, but, you know, perhaps more stability in the Beijing-Washington relationship if Biden is elected, perhaps, but not so much opportunity for Beijing.
Nathan King at the White House for us. Thanks so much for leading us off to discuss Joe Biden's foreign policy. Let's bring in our panel here in Washington, D.C. Anton Fedyashin. He is a professor of history at American University from Maryland. Joel Rubin is a Democratic Party strategist across the river in Virginia. John Sitilides is a geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors. And Einar Tangen is a CGTN current affairs commentator. He's joining us from Beijing. Thank you all for being a part of the broadcast. Joel, let's start with you. This was Biden's big night. It's a night he's been waiting for decades. He had a speech squarely aimed at Donald Trump, saying that there is too much anger, too much fear, too much division. But there was not too much when it came to policy specifics, especially thin when it came to foreign policy. Is that fair to say?
Well, certainly last night, Mike, and thank you for having me as well. Last night, it was a speech to demonstrate that he should be the commander-in-chief, that he has the fortitude and the mindset and the compassion to lead our country out of the coronavirus crisis, and he demonstrated that last night. So the policies, they're embedded in the Democratic Party platform that was adopted this week as well. And about 18 pages out of 80 or so are dedicated to foreign policy. So that's not small. That's about a quarter. But no, you're right. They didn't focus on all the specific steps. But cases were made about how Donald Trump, as commander-in-chief, has let us down. We have 170,000 dead Americans here because of a virus that his number one job is to protect us. And he's not doing that, and there's many other issues as well that were referenced in terms of support for veterans and all. But I think last night, Joe Biden, he wanted to show he's ready to be commander-in-chief and take care of us and take care of this coronavirus crisis.
Yeah, John, it's not uncommon to watch these acceptance speeches. They're meant for a domestic audience, but did you expect to hear more about foreign policy?
Is the question for me, Mike?
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you. I'm sorry for that. No, I don't really think so. Look, Joe Biden, like any candidate, needs to be able to persuade the American people that he is in a position to be the president of all the people. And Joe Biden himself is a very strong believer, going back to his 40 years in the Senate and his 8 years as vice president, in personal diplomacy, whether it's with everyday voters or whether it's with international leaders. So I don't think it's going to be a major issue from the speech perspective. I don't think that's really going to resonate. But I think people that are following foreign policy very closely are listening carefully to what the top advisors to Joe Biden have been talking about. And here I'm speaking of Antony Blinken, who is the top foreign policy advisor to Biden for the past 20 years, Jake Sullivan, who is a top advisor in the Obama administration and in Hillary Clinton's State Department, and even Susan Rice, who is Obama's national security advisor. And I think we're going to get the details of what a Biden foreign policy agenda could look like from these individuals who are very much in the media. They're speaking at think tanks. They're publishing pieces incessantly. And I think we'll have a good sense of what they believe is the need, as they see it, to restore the Obama foreign policy agenda after what they believe to be a number of criticisms of what the current administration has been doing for the last 4 years.
Anton, he did talk a little bit about foreign policy. I want to play a snippet of that, and I want to get your reaction on the other side. So let's listen.
I'll be a president who will stand with our allies and friends and make it clear to our adversaries the days of cozying up to dictators is over. Under President Biden, America will not turn a blind eye to Russian bounties on the heads of American soldiers. Nor will I put up with foreign interference in our most sacred democratic exercise, voting.
Russian bounties, Russian meddling. Were you surprised at all, Anton, and how's that going to be received in Moscow?
Well, I wasn't surprised at all because this has become a mantra in Washington, D.C., so to expect anything else would have been naive. Look, I'm 45 years old. I'm not old, but I've lived through enough elections and election speeches to know that politicians say one thing in the beginning, and then once they get into the White House and they actually have to answer for their policies, they tend to moderate things, and that's a perfectly natural phenomenon, and it's what keeps democracies healthy and operating on the basis of common sense. When Joe Biden speaks about cozying up to autocrats and dictators, I always wonder if he includes the Middle Eastern allies of the United States in that list. And over we've seen that administrations, Democratic or Republican, don't seem to include those guys. So there's always a realpolitik selection of allies and opponents and people you work with. The Russians have become a punching bag, and that's no surprise to anyone in Washington. The question is, what is Joe Biden going to actually do once he's in the White House if he wins this election? I have a feeling that the predictability of the bad relationship, dysfunctional relationship between Moscow and Washington under Biden will actually be welcome in Moscow, because the winds coming out of there are that the Russians are ready to start putting the relationship back on the rails. I don't think they expect anything different from Washington, because the foreign policy establishment was very effective at blocking Trump's initiatives. But what they did also mind is the fact that Trump's administration was completely unpredictable. So I think that they will actually welcome Biden, because they know things won't improve overnight, but at least they will be able to speak to a united front in Washington, no matter how negative that front starts out as.
Einar, it's interesting, Anton saying that Russia's a punching bag. We've seen it, every election cycle. It seems like China becomes a punching bag. Again, Trump saying it today that, China's going to own the U.S. if Biden wins, getting towards that fear factor. But Biden's also been tough on China. I guess that's rather predictable. How's all of this going over in Beijing?
Well, in Beijing, they're looking on with interest, but, it's the devil you see and the devil you don't. They expect that Biden would go back to, as everyone has said, much more predictable ground, and that would be good on the international stage. But there is this expectation that Biden will be pushing this kind of human rights angle, and that it will always be about Taiwan and Hong Kong and things like that, freedoms. And this will create a new kind of tension between them. But in terms of the economics and trade and things like that, they would expect that there would be kind of a let-off, that you wouldn't see Biden using the same kind of tactics, in essence, seizing the daughters of prominent industrialists, tech industrialists like Miss Meng, who's been held in Canada. You could expect a very different tenor and tactics coming out of the Biden administration.
Einar, Nathan kind of touched on this, and there's been a lot of op-ed pieces about it here in the West about, who does China want? And there seems to be these two camps that Nathan was talking about that, as long as the U.S. is moving off the global stage, that leaves a vacuum. China can move in. But then there's this other piece where it's just too chaotic. There was a quote actually in the Washington Post from the director of the international relations at Nanjing University saying the Trump administration is very emotional, very wild. So are there two camps there? I mean, how is it being viewed in China?
Well, it's not about two camps. It's trying to figure out exactly what it means. And it seems to be this kind of trade-off between the short term and the long. With Donald Trump, the short-term dangers are some sort of confrontation, the unpredictability. Over the long term, though, he's really ruining America's soft power. Allies, neighbors, etc., are disillusioned with those very same issues. But over the short term, for the Democrats, it's clear that they will be taking a kind of a moralistic tone. Long term, this will be over the long term, they'll be taking the moralistic term. Over the short term, there might be kind of a relief or a return to normalcy. But it's not going to be easy either way. I think they're just looking on and trying to figure out what's going to happen and how that would affect China.
Joel, you worked in the Obama administration over at the State Department. For those who've read the book, Promise Me, Dad, where he talks about his son's struggle with cancer and ultimate death, it's interesting because a big part of that book is about him crisscrossing the globe, going to hotspots like Ukraine and Iraq and Central America, very active in foreign policy, and that's one of the reasons Obama picked him for his foreign policy chops. So what can we expect?
Yeah, Mike, look, Vice President Biden, when he was the vice president, had his hands his fingers on the pulse of the foreign policy apparatus of the U.S. government, no doubt about it. Tony Blinken, who was mentioned earlier, he was his national security advisor in the vice president's office before becoming Deputy Secretary of State. So Vice President Biden's fingers are all over Obama foreign policy and the legacy. And this idea that he can re-engage is central to his identity, that he has the relationships, but it's not just the relationships, it's It's the mindset about how to advance American interests through diplomacy, how to engage adversaries, how to engage allies, how to work the system, work the UN. Look, we just saw in the last week a fiasco for the United States at the United Nations. We only had one other country vote with us in condemning Iran arms trade, basically not extending the arms embargo. One country voted with us at the UN Security Council. That's the lowest point the United States has experienced at the United Nations since its founding. That's a loss. That's a loss for American power and prestige. And so Joe Biden is going to work to reverse that. And I think that predictability is going to be a welcome, not just here domestically, but also overseas, in that countries are going to begin to understand how to deal with the United States. And one last thing to mention, Donald Trump came in saying he was going to overturn the failures of the past. And we've seen what that looks like. We've seen 3.5 years of that. And that hasn't advanced America's interest towards China. It's only worsened it. It's only made communication harder. It's made our economic relationship harder. It's made our security interests more difficult to advance. So it's a failed experiment. And I think that Joe Biden will put that to rest if he's elected president.
John, Joel talking about reversals, I suspect that when we talk about reversals, the JCPOA, the Iran deal, Paris Accord, withdrawing from the WHO, I would suspect Biden would go in a different direction there. And I want to get your thoughts on that. And then what does that mean for other countries in terms of this pendulum swinging so dramatically back and forth here in the United States?
Well, Vice President Biden has been clear that he will reverse the Trump position on the Paris Climate Accord on day one. So we're going back into Paris if Biden wins. He will fund the World Health Organization, and we will see a re-engagement of Iran on the JCPOA. But to Joel's point that there was only one other vote in the Security Council in favor of the United States, it could very well be that many of those other countries are wrong on Iran. And the idea somehow that because countries have a differing opinion than the United States puts the U.S. on the wrong side, I think is a fallacy. It could be that the other countries need to rethink their strategies towards Iran. And in the end, the U.S. is going to prevail anyway because we're following the guidances that were set up by the Obama administration in the nuclear agreement. On this larger issue of allies, I think sometimes we fall easily into this trope that we've ruined our relationships around the world when the U.S. enjoys very good relations in Asia with India, with the Philippines, with Vietnam, with Taiwan, with South Korea, with Japan, in the Middle East with Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, UAE, in Europe with the UK, with France, with Poland, with Greece, with Italy, and even in Latin America with Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia. So this idea somehow that we have no allies, I think we really need to take a serious look at what we're saying and not fall easily into these tropes. And yes, there have been some smashed plates. President Trump came to Washington saying, we're going to do things differently. There's a very healthy debate as to whether or not it's worked in every instance. But the idea that we somehow get along with a foreign policy establishment that led to many, many fiascos over the last 20 years is something that the American voters wanted to do differently. And it's still going to be decided come this November whether other countries like it or not, that maybe we will continue with the Trump administration into the next 4 years, or if Mr. Biden can pull it off, a different course.
Well, Anton, let's talk a little bit about Europe because he's threatened to leave NATO. He's had kind of tense relations with some of his European allies. In fact, Time magazine back in July had this headline, Why the 74-Year Alliance Between Europe and America is Falling Apart. How do you see things playing out in Europe?
Well, I don't think that the alliance is really falling apart. I think that's Time magazine sort of whipping up the Trump hysteria. I think John was absolutely right in what he said earlier. This hyperventilation about Trump's effect on American foreign policy is precisely that. It really is an exaggeration. The Europeans are ready to re-engage with the United States. I don't think that the damage that has been dealt to American prestige in Europe is really going to last because there's a lot of very positive feeling towards the U.S. in Europe. But there may be a corrective in Western Europe to the liberal interventionist impulses that may come out of the Biden White House. And we're seeing an example of that unfolding right now around what's going on in Belarus. Because if you think back to late 2013 and 2014, when the West Europeans and the Americans, the Obama administration, really became very active in Ukraine and sort of forced it to make a civilizational choice, which as an inherently divided country was suicide for it. The attitude among the Europeans right now towards Belarus, which is going through its own political instability, has been a lot more restrained. And so the West Europeans and the Russians seem to be so far working through the Belarusian crisis from the point of view that no one wants to see this situation explode and turn into another Ukraine. I think that's the corrective we are seeing. But in terms of the Europeans having fallen away from the United States, I think that's an oversimplification and an exaggeration of a relationship which, after 74 years, especially the NATO relationship, is going to do just fine. NATO needs to define its role in the modern world as a whole, but the American-European relationship, I think, is going to be just fine.
Joel, I want to give you a chance to jump in because you kicked off our conversation, and I think you probably see it as more than just a few broken plates.
Yeah, and I appreciate the commentary here. I think, though, it's important to recognize that the United States losing in a vote with only one ally at the United Nations Security Council cannot be spun any other way than a complete failure of the United States at the UN Security Council. And why is that? For example, in this Iran issue, it's because we withdrew from an international agreement, said that we're done with it, but now want to act as if we're still partners in it, which has offended our European allies and others around the globe. So I think the lack of coherence in the Trump administration foreign policy has essentially put the world on edge, where Europe, yes, we're popular, the United States as a country, no doubt about it. The American people, our culture, we're very fortunate to be able to have a relationship with the world. But that's not what Donald Trump made. Donald Trump is squandering that. And so the danger here is that 4 more years of Donald Trump will alienate the world from the United States in a way that's not repairable. And that's what we're looking at here in Washington. In the case of Belarus as well, the silence from the White House is deafening. It's demoralizing. Belarusians are getting harmed in the street trying to protest for their own democracy. The leading opposition figure in Russia is in a coma from a poisoning, and we're not saying anything. These are not things to be proud of as Americans, and we do need to stand up in these instances. And I think the world is watching, and they want to see some leadership. That doesn't mean starting wars everywhere, but actual leadership coming out of the United States.
Einar, I want to talk about Biden and his relationship with President Xi, because we launched here in 2012 in February, and we did a lot of coverage of Biden at the time, the vice president, hosting the vice president of China, which happened to be Xi Jinping at that time. They spent a lot of time here in Washington. They also spent a lot of time out in LA. They went to a Lakers game. Of course, President Trump's talked a great deal about his relationship with President Xi. But both of these candidates, Biden and Trump, have a relationship with Xi and know him. What difference does that make?
Well, I don't think it makes a tremendous amount of difference in terms of policy, but it does in terms of how these countries are going to be perceived. I mean, Donald Trump, he likes to play a sweet and sour game where he says, yes, I'm friends with this guy, but I don't like what they're doing. And he's able to set the bookends very wide, which gives him a tremendous amount of latitude in that. Joe Biden is more of a backroom boy. He was always very effective in Congress and the Senate, in the Senate, where he was able to cross the aisles, get people to work together. You saw that a lot with Vice President Xi at that time, and you can expect more of the same. But, you know, this intellectual gaslighting that somehow everything is just fine, and there's just a little fine-tuning that is needed in terms of the Trump administration. I find that a little bit hard to believe. You go poll after poll. Throughout the world, American prestige and approval is as low as it's ever been. And that is not something you can hide by saying, oh, it's about, you know, some of these minor issues. There's been a steady erosion along that line, and the U.S. has a lot of ground to make up. I'll be very interested to see what they do with the economic side. Will Biden approve new judges for the WTO? What will he do with the TPP? Will he try to rejoin? These economic moves are going to be center stage as the world faces a post-pandemic period, assuming that there is an antiviral.
I want to listen to a little bit more sound from last night's speech. This one kind of dealing with national security. Let's listen.
As president, I'll make you a promise. I'll protect America. I will defend us from every attack, seen and unseen, always, without exception, every time.
Joel, it seems like Republicans are always the party that seem to play up national security, but during this convention, we saw Secretary of State, former Secretary of State Colin Powell, who was in a Republican administration. We see a lot of Republicans coming out. Today, 70 former Republican national security officials out with a letter backing Biden. Is this something that can be played in the remaining 75 or so days in this contest?
Well, Mike, the election itself, the real fight is going to be in the swing states. There are about 17 swing states that are identified that are the ones that will decide who becomes the next president. And those states have a lot of voters up for grabs. They have voters who were for Barack Obama in 2012, and then they went to Donald Trump in 2016. And so this kind of big tent convention that we saw with a lot of Republican support helps Joe Biden make the case to those swing voters in those states that they can be safe with him, that there's room in his tent, basically, for their positions. And that's critical. That's a kind of a validation. Now, there will be cynics who say, aha, look, it's the establishment coming back together for Joe Biden. I'm sorry. These are professionals who have experience and they know what they're doing and have a track record. Nobody's perfect in terms of every single detail. But when you have 70 former national security officials from administrations coming out in favor of a candidate, that's a major win. And so that is something that is going to play well in these swing states. And that's an argument that Biden's going to carry with him for the next couple of months.
Well, we'll certainly be watching as the campaign moves into full speed. We've got the Republican convention coming up next week. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. But the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.